The bank was unusually busy that afternoon, the line stretching all the way to the entrance. Customers shuffled impatiently, checking their phones, sighing under their breath. At one of the teller counters, Sandra, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a forced smile, adjusted her name tag and tapped her manicured nails against the desk. She had been working here for years, long enough to know which customers were worth her time and which ones weren't. Then, the next person in line stepped forward. A woman, maybe in her late 30s, with deep brown skin and neatly styled hair, walked up with a quiet confidence. She held a small stack of papers in one hand and a black leather purse in the other. Her name was Lisa. She was dressed simply but elegantly. Pressed slacks, a soft beige blouse, and a delicate gold bracelet on her wrist. There was something about her presence, something calm and assured, though she carried herself without arrogance. Sandra barely looked up. "Next," she called, her tone sharp, already sounding annoyed. Lisa approached with a polite smile. "Good afternoon," she said, sliding her paperwork forward. "I'd like to deposit this check, please." Sandra glanced at the check and then at Lisa. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Lisa to notice. Her lips pressed together, her eyebrows arched just a little higher. "Is this your check?" Sandra asked, her voice taking on a skeptical edge. Lisa kept her polite smile but felt something tighten in her chest. "Yes," she replied. Sandra picked up the check and flipped it between her fingers, examining it as if it might dissolve in her hands. She looked at the amount, high but not impossibly so. Still, her lips curled slightly, and Lisa could almost predict what would come next. "You sure?" Sandra asked, her voice louder now. Some heads in the line turned slightly. A man standing behind Lisa shifted on his feet, suddenly more interested in the exchange. Lisa took a slow breath. She had been in situations like this before. She knew exactly what was happening. Sandra sighed and placed the check down, shaking her head. "I'm going to need some additional identification," she said flatly. "And proof of where you got this." Lisa blinked. "I've been banking here for years," she said, her voice steady. "My ID is on file." Sandra shrugged, folding her arms. "Company policy." The tension in the air was thick now. Customers were watching, some pretending not to, others openly interested. Lisa felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment, the unspoken assumptions. But she wasn't about to let this slide. Lisa took a step closer, looking Sandra directly in the eyes. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet power behind it. "What did you just say to me?" she asked. The bank fell silent. Even the other tellers seemed to pause. Sandra hesitated, suddenly aware that the energy in the room had shifted. And in the next moment, Lisa said something that made the entire branch freeze. Sandra swallowed, suddenly aware of the way the energy in the room had shifted. Lisa's question wasn't loud, wasn't angry, but it carried weight, an undeniable force that made everyone pause. The hum of quiet conversations, the soft beeping of the ATM, even the tapping of fingers against phone screens, all of it seemed to stop at once. The air felt heavier now. For a moment, Sandra hesitated, her fingers twitching against the counter. She wasn't used to being questioned, not like this. Most people, when faced with her skepticism, either fumbled through their bags for more proof or walked away, defeated. But Lisa wasn't backing down. She was standing tall, her eyes steady, waiting for an answer. "I said I need more identification," Sandra repeated, but her voice wasn't as firm this time. Lisa exhaled slowly. She had been here before, maybe not in this exact situation but in moments just like it. Moments where she had to prove herself, justify her presence, explain why she deserved to be treated like everyone else. It was exhausting, always having to walk that fine line between standing up for herself and not giving people a reason to label her as difficult or angry. She had learned long ago that people like Sandra rarely saw their own bias. They believed they were just following policy, just doing their job. But there was always something unspoken behind their words, something that made them look at her check a little longer, question her a little harder. Lisa didn't look away. My ID is on file, she repeated, her voice just as calm as before. And I've been a customer here for years. I know the policy. And I know that what you're asking for isn't required. Sandra let out a small, forced laugh, shaking her head. Ma'am, I'm just trying to do my job. If you don't have the proper verification, I can't process this check. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Would you have asked for extra verification if I looked different? A few murmurs rippled through the line. The man standing behind Lisa shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Sandra and then back at Lisa. A woman near the waiting area turned slightly in her chair, her interest piqued. Sandra scoffed. Excuse me. Lisa folded her arms. You heard me. For the first time, Sandra looked uncertain. The confidence she had a moment ago, the dismissiveness in her tone, the smug assurance in her posture, was starting to crack. She wasn't expecting to be challenged, at least not like this. A few feet away, another bank employee, a younger teller with soft brown curls and a nervous expression, glanced toward the manager's office. She looked torn, like she wasn't sure if she should step in or pretend she hadn't heard anything. Sandra cleared her throat. Look, I don't make the rules, she said, but there was something defensive in her voice now. If you have a problem, you can take it up with management. Lisa's lips pressed together. She could feel her pulse in her ears, but she refused to let the frustration show. This was the part that always stung the most. Not just the assumption that she didn't belong, but the way people like Sandra acted as if they weren't responsible for their own actions. As if their words, their choices, their thinly veiled suspicion were all just some unavoidable part of the system. Lisa had spent her whole life navigating spaces like this. Classrooms, boardrooms, restaurants, stores. It was always subtle, always wrapped in something that could be excused. A security guard watching her a little too closely while she shopped. A waiter hesitating before handing her the check, as if waiting for confirmation that she could afford it. A coworker raising their eyebrows when she mentioned her job title, surprised that someone like her had made it that far. And now here she was again. Lisa took a breath. You know what? She said, tilting her head slightly. Let's do that. Sandra frowned. Do what? Let's talk to management, Lisa said simply. Sandra blinked, like she hadn't expected Lisa to actually call her bluff. The younger teller nearby bit her lip, eyes darting toward the glass-walled office at the back of the bank. The manager, a man in his mid-50s with a neatly trimmed beard and a navy blue suit, was sitting at his desk reviewing paperwork. He hadn't noticed the tension unfolding at the counter. Lisa turned slightly and gestured toward the office. Go ahead, she said. I'll wait. Sandra hesitated. The confidence in her posture had faded completely now, replaced with something else, something like unease. She glanced around the room, suddenly aware of just how many people were watching. The silence stretched. Lisa didn't move. She didn't blink. And in that moment something shifted. It wasn't just about the check anymore. It wasn't even about Sandra. It was about everyone in that room. Everyone who had ever been dismissed, questioned, made to feel small for no reason other than someone else's assumptions. The bank had been loud a few minutes ago, filled with the usual sounds of a busy afternoon. Footsteps, conversations, the rhythmic beeping of card readers. Now it was eerily quiet. Sandra's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She looked down at the check again, then back up at Lisa. And for the first time since the conversation started, she looked unsure of what to do next. The bank felt frozen in time. People stood still, eyes shifting between Lisa and Sandra, waiting to see what would happen next. Sandra's fingers hovered over the check, her nails tapping lightly against the desk. For a split second, she looked like she was considering something, maybe backtracking, maybe pushing forward. But whatever it was, she wasn't quick enough. A voice broke the silence. Is there a problem here? The question came from behind Lisa. A man in his early 40s, dressed in a gray blazer and jeans, had stepped forward in the line. He had sharp eyes, the kind that had seen situations like this before, and something about his expression said he wasn't about to ignore what was happening. Sandra shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable under all the attention. "No problem," she said quickly, her voice a little tighter than before. Lisa turned her head slightly, acknowledging the man but keeping her focus on Sandra. "Actually," she said, "there is a problem. I've been banking here for years, but for some reason today, my check is being treated like it doesn't belong to me." A murmur rippled through the line. The man in the blazer crossed his arms. "Interesting," he said, his tone neutral but pointed. "Because I just deposited a check about the same size, and nobody asked me any questions." Sandra's jaw tightened. She glanced down at the papers in front of her, as if searching for a way out. "Like I said," she muttered, "it's just a routine security measure." Lisa let out a slow breath. "Routine for who?" Another pause. More shifting in the line. Even the security guard near the entrance had taken notice now. His posture straightening, eyes flickering between them. Then a new voice joined the conversation. "Everything okay over here?" The bank manager had finally stepped out of his office. His navy blue suit was crisp, his expression carefully neutral. He was used to diffusing tension, to smoothing things over before they turned into something bigger. He glanced at Sandra first, then at Lisa, then at the growing number of customers watching the exchange. Lisa turned to face him directly. "I was trying to deposit my check," she explained, keeping her voice steady. "But I was told I need extra identification, even though my ID is on file. Even though I've been a customer here for years." The manager's eyes flickered toward Sandra, who suddenly looked very busy straightening a stack of papers. He cleared his throat. "Well, I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Lisa held up a hand. "Before we call it that," she said, "I'd like to know something." The manager hesitated. "Go on." Lisa gestured toward the man in the blazer. "He just deposited a check about the same size. Did you ask him for extra identification?" Sandra's eyes darted toward the manager, as if silently begging for backup. But he was smart enough to realize there was no easy way out of this. The air was too thick with tension, too many people were listening. The manager cleared his throat again, his voice softer now. "Let's step into my office and discuss this privately." Lisa tilted her head slightly. "Why privately? This happened out here." A few quiet gasps passed through the crowd. Someone in the back whispered, "She's got a point." The manager exhaled, pressing his lips together. I think I'd rather handle it right here," Lisa interrupted, keeping her tone polite but firm. "That way we're all on the same page." Sandra looked miserable now, her shoulders stiff, her face pale. The younger teller behind her was frozen in place, fingers hovering over her keyboard like she was afraid to move. The tension was unbearable. And then, right when it seemed like the weight of the silence might break the room in half, Lisa did something no one expected. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and placed it gently on the counter. "Since we're talking about policies," she said, her voice cool and measured, "maybe I should record this. That way, I have something to reference in case I need to file a complaint." Sandra's face drained of color. The manager's posture shifted. "Now let's not." "I have every right," Lisa said simply, picking up her phone and holding it at her side. "It's my account, my money, and I'd like to make sure I'm being treated fairly." The silence deepened. And then, before the manager could speak, before Sandra could argue, something happened that no one saw coming. A woman from the waiting area stood up. "I was wondering why she was taking so long with you," the woman said, stepping forward. She was in her 50s, dressed in a dark green coat with a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. "I've been banking here for a decade, and I've never seen them ask for extra identification over a check deposit." Lisa turned toward her, surprised. The woman nodded. "You're not alone. I've been through this before too." Another voice joined in. "Same here," a younger woman near the ATM said, shaking her head. "Happened to my dad once. They made him wait almost an hour just to approve his own deposit." Sandra's breathing had become shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. The manager ran a hand down his face, realizing how badly this was spiraling. All right, he said, raising a hand. Let's take a step back. Lisa didn't move. The man in the blazer didn't move. No one did. Because in that moment, it wasn't just about Lisa anymore. It was about every person in that bank who had ever been treated differently and told it was just policy. And now the truth was out in the open. The air inside the bank was heavy, thick with unspoken words and unasked questions. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was a statement, a realization settling over everyone in the room. Sandra looked trapped, her hands gripping the edges of her station like she could somehow steady herself. The manager's face had gone stiff, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of too many watching eyes. Lisa hadn't moved. Her phone was still in her hand, the screen dark but the threat clear. She didn't need to press record. The moment was already imprinted in the minds of everyone standing there. The older woman in the green coat crossed her arms, shaking her head. This is exactly why people stop coming to banks like this. The man in the blazer nodded, stepping up beside Lisa. And why we start taking our business elsewhere. Another murmur rippled through the room. Someone shifted near the door, as if debating whether to leave or stay just to see how this played out. Even the security guard, usually a silent observer in moments like these, looked uncertain. The manager cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. Now, I don't think we need to escalate things. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Escalate, she echoed, her voice quiet but sharp. I came here to deposit a check. That's all. Sandra's lips parted like she wanted to argue, but she caught herself, pressing them into a thin line instead. The manager shifted his weight. Let's just apologize, the woman in the green coat interrupted. The word hung in the air. Sandra's head snapped up. The manager's eyes flickered toward her, his jaw clenching. Lisa didn't say anything. She just waited. The weight of the moment pressed down on Sandra like a spotlight she couldn't escape. Her face was pale, her shoulders stiff, and for the first time there was no easy way out. No dismissive excuse, no quick brush off. The room was watching, and silence wasn't going to save her this time. She swallowed, her throat working around the word before it even left her lips. She started, but the word got caught somewhere between her pride and her regret. Lisa stayed still, giving her nothing to hold on to, no easy out. Sandra tried again. I didn't mean for it to come across that way. The words felt weak, unsteady. The kind of apology that wasn't really an apology at all. Lisa's expression didn't change. Come across what way? Sandra blinked, her fingers curling against the desk. She glanced at the manager like he might step in, but even he seemed to understand that this wasn't his moment to fix. Lisa tilted her head slightly. You had no problem questioning me when I first walked up, she said. You had no problem raising your voice when I pushed back. But now, suddenly, you don't have much to say. Sandra exhaled sharply through her nose, her frustration slipping through the cracks. I was just doing my job. Lisa let that sit between them. Then she spoke. No, you weren't. A few people in the line murmured their agreement. The man in the blazer nodded. The woman in the green coat folded her arms tighter. Sandra looked like she wanted to disappear. The manager finally stepped in, his voice careful. I think it would be best if we move forward, he said, forcing another tight smile. Lisa, I can personally process your transaction right now. Lisa didn't move. I want her to do it. Sandra's eyes widened. What? You had so many questions about my check, Lisa said, sliding it back across the counter. Go ahead. Process it. The tension spiked again. Sandra's hands hovered over the keyboard. For a second she looked like she might refuse. But then she saw the way the room was watching her. The way her manager's face had turned rigid. The way the woman in the green coat had already pulled her phone out as if preparing for something worse. Lisa was giving her a chance. Long pause. Then, slowly, Sandra reached for the check. Her fingers were stiff, her movements mechanical. The sound of the keyboard clicking filled the silence. Every keystroke, every flicker of the screen, every second that passed was heavy with meaning. Lisa didn't look away. Neither did anyone else. And then, just as Sandra was about to finish the transaction, something unexpected happened. Something that made everyone hold their breath. Her hands trembled. Just slightly. But enough to be noticed. Sandra's fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling ever so slightly. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every person in the room was watching her, waiting. The only sound was the soft tapping of the keys as she hesitated, her face pale and stiff. Then, as if something inside her had finally given way, she took a sharp breath and pressed the final key. The machine beeped, the screen blinked, and Lisa's deposit was officially processed. Lisa should have felt relief. The check had gone through. The argument was over. But something wasn't right. Sandra was still staring at the screen, her face frozen, her body stiff. The manager noticed it too. "Sandra," he said, his voice low. "What's the issue?" Sandra blinked rapidly, almost as if she'd forgotten where she was. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then cleared her throat. "There's something wrong." Lisa's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Sandra swallowed hard. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, then she turned the monitor slightly, just enough for Lisa and the manager to see. The screen displayed an error message, bright red and flashing. "Account frozen. Fraud alert. Contact head office." A wave of murmurs rippled through the line. The woman in the green coat leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing. The man in the blazer shifted on his feet. Even the security guard took a cautious step forward. Lisa's heart pounded. "That doesn't make any sense." Sandra's voice was quieter now, unsure. I don't know why it's showing this. I've never seen this happen before." The manager's expression darkened. "Let me handle this." He stepped forward, pulling the keyboard toward him. His fingers flew across the keys, trying to override the alert, but the same message popped up again. Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat. This has to be a mistake. The manager didn't look at her. "I'm calling the head office." He picked up the phone at the counter and dialed quickly, turning away slightly as he spoke in hushed tones. Lisa clenched her hands into fists, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Sandra's behavior anymore. This was something bigger. Her account was in perfect standing. There was no reason for it to be flagged. Ugh. Her eyes flickered toward Sandra, whose expression was unreadable now. But there was something in the way she sat so still, in the way she avoided eye contact, that sent a chill down Lisa's spine. Had she done something? Before Lisa could ask, the manager turned back around, his face unreadable. "I need to speak with you privately," he said to Lisa. His voice carefully controlled. Lisa crossed her arms. "No. If there's an issue, we're discussing it right here." The people in the bank murmured in agreement. The manager exhaled through his nose. "Your account has been flagged due to suspicious activity," he said, his voice low but firm. "There's a report that a fraudulent check was deposited under your name recently. Until this is cleared up, all transactions are frozen." Lisa's stomach dropped. "That's impossible." The manager glanced at Sandra, then back at Lisa. "I need to ask. Have you deposited any large checks in the past few weeks?" Lisa's mind reeled. She had deposited checks, but nothing unusual, nothing that would raise red flags. "I get paid through direct deposit. I haven't deposited anything unusual." The woman in the green coat stepped closer. "This doesn't add up." Sandra finally spoke, her voice quiet but edged with something hard to place. "We're just following procedure." Lisa caught it then, the slight flicker in Sandra's eyes, the tension in her jaw. Something wasn't right. The man in the blazer frowned. How does a loyal customer go from a simple deposit to a fraud accusation in a matter of minutes? The manager hesitated. "We're just following up on." Lisa suddenly understood. Her pulse pounded. When was this so-called fraudulent check deposited? The manager looked at the screen. His lips parted slightly, then pressed into a thin line. Lisa's heart raced. Well, the manager exhaled. Yesterday. A sharp intake of breath came from the crowd. The people around her looked at each other, confusion settling in. Lisa took a step forward. Then explain to me how I deposited a fraudulent check when I was out of town all day yesterday. Sandra stiffened. Lisa's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. I have receipts. I have GPS tracking on my phone. I have people who saw me. I was nowhere near this bank. So tell me, how did this happen? The manager's face darkened. He turned to Sandra. Pull up the check image. Sandra hesitated. Then, slowly, she clicked through the system. The screen flickered, and an image of the check appeared. Lisa felt a cold chill crawl up her spine. The signature wasn't hers. It was a forgery. And suddenly everything made sense. The unnecessary questioning. The hesitation. The way Sandra had stalled. Someone inside the bank had done this. And now Lisa knew exactly where to start looking. A heavy silence filled the bank, thick with tension. Lisa's eyes stayed locked on the check image on the screen, her pulse pounding in her ears. The signature wasn't hers. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. The woman in the green coat leaned in, squinting. That's not even close to matching. The man in the blazer crossed his arms. Somebody forged that check. The manager's jaw clenched. His face had lost all of its forced politeness, replaced with something far more serious. Sandra, he said, his voice sharp. Who processed this check? Sandra's entire body stiffened. Her fingers twitched on the mouse. I don't know. I'd have to check. Lisa stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with steel. No need to check. You already know, don't you? Sandra's mouth opened, but no words came out. The way she gripped the desk, the way her face paled, it was all there. The manager wasn't stupid. He turned toward her, his expression darkening. Sandra, were you the one who handled this transaction? Sandra's lips pressed into a tight line. The weight of the room was pressing in on her. The eyes of every customer, every employee, watching, waiting. I don't remember, she stammered, but the lie was weak, cracking at the edges. Lisa let out a slow breath, her voice quiet but cutting. You didn't just process it, did you? Sandra flinched. What are you? Lisa held her gaze. You forged it. A gasp rippled through the bank. Even the security guard took a step forward. Sandra's breath hitched. That's ridiculous, she sputtered. Why would I do something like that? The manager's voice was sharp. That's what we'd all like to know. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then suddenly Lisa spoke again. You didn't expect me to come in today, did you? Sandra swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. Lisa's gaze didn't waver. You thought I'd be too embarrassed to fight back. That I'd walk away, humiliated, and never dig deeper. But here we are. Sandra's breathing was uneven now. Her hands clenched into fists. The manager turned to her. Sandra, I'm giving you one chance to explain yourself before I call security. And the police. The color drained from Sandra's face. Her eyes darted toward the door, toward the people around her. Her mind was racing, searching for a way out. Then, just when it seemed like she might stay silent, she broke. It wasn't my idea, she blurted, her voice shaky. I swear, I wasn't the one who planned it. The bank erupted in murmurs. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Then whose idea was it? Sandra hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the keyboard, clicking through a few screens. Then, slowly, she turned the monitor. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The name on the transaction approval. The assistant manager. The very same one who had been standing silently at the back of the room this whole time. The entire room turned toward him. His face, which had been unreadable until now, twisted slightly, just for a split second, before smoothing back into a cold mask. Lisa exhaled sharply. Guess we have our answer. The manager's expression hardened. Security, escort both of them to my office. And someone call the police. Sandra's entire body slumped. The assistant manager, on the other hand, only let out a low sigh before shaking his head. This is ridiculous. But it wasn't. Lisa had known from the beginning something wasn't right. And now the truth was out. As Sandra and the assistant manager were led away, the tension in the bank finally began to ease. The woman in the green coat turned to Lisa with a small nod of respect. The man in the blazer muttered, "Glad someone stood up to them." Lisa let out a slow breath, her pulse still racing, but this time with relief. She had come in for a simple deposit. She had almost walked away, humiliated. But now, because she had refused to stay silent, two people who had been exploiting their positions were finally being held accountable. And as she picked up her receipt and turned to leave, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let anyone make her feel small again. The weight in the room began to lift as security escorted Sandra and the assistant manager away. The whispers died down and people shifted, some shaking their heads, others exchanging glances. The woman in the green coat let out a breath, looking at Lisa with something between admiration and gratitude. "Well," she said, crossing her arms. "That was something." Lisa let out a small, tired laugh. "Not exactly how I planned my afternoon." The man in the blazer stepped forward. "You handled that better than most would. People don't always fight back when something like this happens." Lisa nodded slowly. "Yeah, well, I wasn't about to let them get away with it." The manager, who had been speaking in hushed tones with another bank employee, turned back to Lisa. His expression softer now, less guarded. "I want to personally apologize for what happened today," he said. "This should never have happened to you." Lisa studied him for a moment. He had started the conversation defending Sandra, brushing off Lisa's concerns. But now, after seeing the truth unfold, he seemed humbled, almost embarrassed. "I appreciate that," Lisa said. "But an apology won't fix this." The manager gave a slow nod. "You're absolutely right." He glanced back at the screen, then back at Lisa. "We'll be launching a full internal investigation. I'll make sure your account is unfrozen immediately, and I'll work with our fraud department to clear your name." Lisa exhaled, finally feeling some of the tension in her chest loosen. "That's a start." A bank teller from a few desks down, a younger woman who had stayed silent through the whole ordeal, stepped forward cautiously. "For what it's worth," she said hesitantly, "not everyone here is like them." Lisa gave her a small, appreciative nod. "I know." There was another beat of silence before Lisa turned to leave. She could feel the lingering stares, but this time, they weren't filled with judgment or doubt. They were filled with something else, respect. As she walked toward the door, the security guard gave her a small nod. The woman in the green coat called out, "You take care now." Lisa smiled, pushing the door open and stepping back into the crisp afternoon air. The sunlight felt different now, brighter, warmer, like it had been waiting for her. She stood there for a moment, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. She had come in expecting nothing more than a routine bank visit. She had been humiliated, doubted, made to feel as if she didn't belong. But she hadn't let that stop her. She had stood her ground. She had forced them to see her, to hear her, to acknowledge the truth. And because of that, two people who had been abusing their power were being held accountable. As she walked toward her car, she glanced at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to post about what had happened, to share her experience with the world. But then she thought about the people inside, the employees who had watched silently, the customers who had spoken up, the manager who had learned a lesson. Some things didn't need to be posted to make an impact. Some things changed people just by happening. She slipped her phone back into her bag and took a deep breath. Then, without looking back, she got into her car and drove away, knowing that today, she had done more than just deposit a check. She had made sure her voice was heard.